All right, you have my closing.
Yes, absolutely.
We have a minute to go.
Some damage again here. Down,
Huh?
down.
Tom? He's moving,
Oh, he is.
yeah. His house is already.
Hi, Ben.
I lived up there, I thought he lived on
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes, welcome.
Hi, thanks. Hello.
We got just a minute or so to go and then we'll start the meeting.
That was in the stone.
Talk to you a letter.
Privilege and a premium to live within the city limits.
Do you want to
Okay, you're not when the interest rates are now over 7%.
Yeah. Oh, 13 different reasons they try to give for why they actually went on versus what they thought it was supposed to do.
Okay, I mean, we'll call this meeting to order. And we'll start with roll call. Baumgartner here, Brown,
Here.
Dillon. Evers,
Here.
Hanson here, Hawkinson.
Here.
And McDonald, no, and just as an update, Susie and I both got notice from Tom that he is moving, he and his wife are moving from town. So I checked on the website today and his house is listed for sale and I think there's an open house on Saturday. So I don't know, I said, where are you moving? And then he never answered, so.
Yeah, I haven't heard.
I don't know.
I know he's based out of Pennsylvania area for work, but I
Yeah.
don't know about his wife.
Yeah. All right, and also in the room are Susie, Executive Director, Elizabeth Torkelson, the administrator.
There you go. That's fine.
And we welcome Ben Winchester via Zoom. Thank you for being here. We'll do a quick agenda approval. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda?
The only change that is in there, from what I sent out last week is Olivia Storage LLC and Austin Nybauer will be joining us at some point in time. And then there's a couple little documents in your packet about his request.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
So, second, John.
Oregon and John, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, the agenda is approved and let's do the same for the minutes. I don't think we got these in advance, so
No,
I
I'm
take a couple of
Very
minutes
sorry about that.
to review them. Please do so.
Make a motion to approve minutes.
Okay, George, is there a second?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed? All right, minutes approved. All right, well, that takes us to the exciting part of our meeting, to the housing presentation by Ben Winchester. Welcome, Ben.
Hi, everybody. Really my pleasure to be here. Thanks for all your service on your committee there. If you could provide the screen sharing for me too, I'm gonna share some data on a PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's not a problem.
Yep, thanks. So really, my name is Ben Winchester. I work for University Extension. Probably know Extension is the 4-H people. I'm in a different sliver called community in the Department of Community Development. So I've been working with educators across the state and really across the region doing community and economic development work. My own background is I'm a rural sociologist. I went to school in Morris. I got to know Mary Page through the regional partnership for good, well, I don't know, 15 years there. So a real strong affinity in my heart for Olivia there and the work that she's done and the role that she had with the university. But with that, my own background is I went to school in Morris. I'm kind of a data geek. But really the story that I like to tell is one of kind of how our small towns are changing. And really the premise behind, I had shared a lot of this at our RDO meeting a couple weeks ago here, but I'm going to share this and hopefully it's not going to be as like boring as a PowerPoint can be, but we get what we get here. Let me grab this. And then I do want to talk about, some of the research I've done over the years. You can be able to see my face here, so I'm not super, boring, hopefully. But really, my life's work has been in what I call rewriting the rural narrative, and that, really our small towns aren't dying. And I kind of end the conversation around our small towns dying with, like, why, if we're truly dying, then why can't I find a home to buy? Like, there's home, like you just heard about a home for sale. Like, man, how long is that going to be available? Like, this is the number one constraint we see on pretty much every conversation is local housing. And especially as it pertains to economic development, I think it's important because, it's economic development has changed so much over the past 20 years right now that, we used to work hard to be creating all these jobs. Now we have the jobs, we just don't have the people to fill them. And so I think for the past 15 years, I've been working with RDCs and initiative foundations to really talk about, what are the trends in the demographics that are causing a lot of these shifts? Like, why are we in this position we're in? Right now, there's just on the housing side, a bunch of finger pointing and paralysis. But generally, it's, we find out that nobody really is responsible for all the housing in town. So let's talk a little bit about what I call rural housing. I call it moving in, moving out, moving over, and moving on. And we added the moving on because there is like literally a lot of death across rural communities that's happening. The grain of rural from 25 years ago is now passing away. And what does that mean for our rural communities? And we're in the midst of this right now. So I think the bigger question I've got in all of this is, what is the role of our public agencies in this, in housing, right? Like, I'm not going to give Susie's mom money for her house, right? Like, that's a private asset. At the same time, your house is a public good. Like, what if that house isn't there for the next generation to live in, or for the next generation to work in, or lead your offices in? So this becomes a point of continuity for our communities. So I do want to talk about this kind of narrative that I work within, is that there's a brain drain. We live in the middle of nowhere, like a sleepy town that's dying. And why do we talk about the dying small towns? It's because our populations keep going down. And like, we wonder why. We don't exactly know why. I'm going to give you an answer here in a minute. But really, a lot of times when we have this total, our total population numbers come out every year from the census, people want to see the map. And they're like, hey, Ben, make a map of the winners and the losers. And like, oh, here's where all the losers are in white. Your county lost population. I mean, it's a tongue in cheek, right? But your populations keep going down. And this sets the tone for your narrative being negative, because ideally you would like to see your population go up, but there's a reason why it's going down, and it's this. So you probably know the RDC at Appleton, Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission there. Dawn Hagelin runs that outfit. I'd worked with her for a long time, and one of the first charts when I realized kind of what was going on here that I want you to be aware of is this. So we looked at this historical population in her 5-county region there. It's pretty rural, and their population from 1960 to 2010 went down by 35%, went from 69,000 to 45. Like, they're big losers, and that's typical for the narrative that small towns are dying. But if you look at the line right below that, the number of households in the region went up by 3%. Well, we're trying to use our total population numbers as our indicator for failure, but at the same time, our homes are all filled. Like, how can that be? The average household size in this country has gone down a full person since 1940. So in 1940, every house would have 3.6 people. Like, you don't have fractional people, but like on average, your average household size has 3.6 people. Today, it's a full person smaller because, the families that have kids are fewer. The families that have kids have fewer kids. So the composition of our households leads to population decline, but our homes are still full. So what happens again, especially around the brain drain language, our kids are leaving. Like, what happens when your 2 kids graduate and leave? Well, your population went down by 2, but your households are still occupied and full because those kids weren't homeowners. They were living with their parents. And we have a much more common situation today where we have 2 older people in the household and one of them passes away, and the surviving spouse stays in that home. And so now what happened to your population? Again, it went down by 1, but your occupied households are still the same. So this is part of why, we want to expand the idea of what we're looking at beyond just people, because we know on average, larger households are fewer. We don't have very many big households anymore. A majority of our households have 2 or fewer people in them. So again, when I look at the data, it's like, our population numbers dictate our narrative, right? Big Stone County lost 9% of your population. You're big losers, right? This is tongue in cheek, right? You're big losers. You lost your population. But housing only went down by 2%, which is within the realm of natural attrition. Lake of the Woods lost 11% of their population over 10 years, but their housing units went up by 13%. There's a real kind of inequity in seeing your community solely through the eyes of your population. When our population has gotten older, our population in the households has gotten smaller, but that doesn't mean we're dying. Our homes are still full. So why are we full? Because there's been a consistent pattern of people moving in. So I like to just look at our housing units across our communities, because a housing unit persists over time. A house was a home to someone before, it's a home to someone today, and we hope it's going to be a home to someone in the future if it doesn't become dilapidated through the lack of choices on, maintaining that property. So meanwhile, we've done all these studies about people moving in. We're not going to get in depth on the moving in piece, but I will just repeatedly say there's a consistent pattern of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s moving into rural communities since the 70s. It's filled up our homes. And when we ask people why they moved to your small town and rural place, and this is Western Minnesota too, Southwestern Minnesota, no place is immune to interest of people wanting to live there. It's why you have a housing shortage. So meanwhile, when we ask these newcomers, like, why did you move to a small town? Like, the top three reasons that people give is, number one was a simpler pace of life. That was like immediate access to recreation, getting away from a commute. We call them push and pull factors. There's things that pull you to the town and region you're in. There's things that are pushing you away from where you were. And it changes with your life experience too, and where you are and how old you are. Number two is safety and security, especially high with people with children and with female-headed households. And the third top reason that people gave for moving to a rural place or a small town was the low cost of housing. So really nowhere in the top 10 was a job. Like, people needed to get a job. And it used to be more people said they moved because they had a job or a job offer. But today, just 4 out of 10 newcomer households are moving to your town because they have a job in your town. A majority of movers aren't working in your town. And I think I've got data here or later on about the number of people commuting in and out all the time is a huge number. So that's one thing, is not everybody is moving for a job. We're trying to fill our residents where people want to live here for all of these non-economic related factors. So number two that I want to hit on here around these new people moving in, new households moving in, are a majority of them are not from there. So just 1 in 4 newcomer households are from that community. And you'd like to think that, like, how else are people going to know about Clontarf unless they grew up here and moved away? Well, people hear about Clontarf and move in there all the time. We've documented this. So it's really interesting to look through the eyes of your newcomers, whether you see them or not, to understand how your community is changing. Your city clerks know who they are, your county commissioners know, your property managers know who they are, your real estate agents know who they are. So meanwhile, there's been a regular, consistent pattern of people moving into our rural communities, and I'm just going to call it the brain gain. So there's really just people waiting in line to move in right now. There truly are. But we know people are commuting all the time. Even the county boundary of Renville County, like every day, 2,500 people are commuting in to work in the county. Every day, 4,000 people that live in the county boundaries are commuting out to go work somewhere else. And just 2,900 of the 6, so like 35%, both live and work in the county. So we have completely decoupled home and work. So the traditional economic development model of industrial recruitment, meaning we need to bring in a business. And then when you have a business, that's the reason people are going to move in. Well, that's not how it is anymore. Like, you don't need the more jobs. We have these jobs. We need to actually fill these jobs. So for us, it's not about industrial recruitment. It's about resident recruitment. But within the concept of resident recruitment, excuse me, is understanding that people don't always live in the town they work in. Like, it is a matter of fact that now just 48% of Minnesotans work in the county they live in. But you're trying to, like, achieve all these outcomes at your county level, right? Or at the city level, as if that jurisdiction is the one end all be all, but it's not. You're in this interwebbed mix of where people live and where people work that goes like 2 counties out. So now, when we want to better understand who's moving in and who's moving out, we need to expand our view beyond, because there are plenty of people that are coming into Olivia every day that don't live in the county even. So meanwhile, we've got all these people that want to move in, just build new housing, like, end of story. Like, why doesn't that happen? Because it's too expensive. So meanwhile, we tend to hear a lot of times about workforce housing, workforce housing, workforce housing. And kind of what we had found out is that really doesn't work. Like we know, number one, there just aren't enough developers, period. Housing does not get built where there's desire. Housing gets built where there's income. That said, some communities like yours do have developers, which is not the rule. It is the exception if you have a builder accessible to your community. So when we talk about this, what are the dynamics around housing? We thought we were going to see a lot more movement in housing 10 years ago, and I want to show you this. So I mentioned this earlier, right? The grain of rural from 2010, 15 years ago, and these are where the oldest counties are, right? And especially across the Great Plains. Well, the grain of rural from then is now turning into the dying of rural. So we used to think that a bunch of homes were going to be opened up like by today. And then when we started to see this housing and labor shortage, which are the same thing, you're going to hear me say this. You don't have a labor shortage. You have a housing shortage. And why is it? I believe this chart explains everything. So historically, in the past, this is by age, it's age across here. So as people get older, this is home ownership rate. They move out of home ownership. Not everybody. I'm not trying to kick everybody out of their homes. I'm trying to say that in the past, 20 to 30% of older people would typically move out of their homes once they hit the age of retirement. And what do they move into? Apartments, patio homes, kind of move over housing, we called it. Well, now, today, this generation, so the green bar is all previous generations. The blue bar is this generation today. They are not moving out of their homes, and we couldn't really figure out why, like what is going on here. So there's a difference here between previous generations moving out and the current generation not moving out. What is the difference between these two are all the homeowners that would have moved in. But right now, in this model that we've got of demographic shift, you had a lot of people move in the 90s. They filled up almost all the vacant homes. And then these people stayed. A bunch of kids may have left. Your population went down. And now we see folks retire over the past 15 years. And as these people have retired, they have stayed in their home. Rather than moving into different housing, this is inhibiting the churn of housing. When typically 20 to 30% of your workforce would move out after retirement, now they're not. So you can't even, if you're a business owner and in the past 2 years you watched 3 employees retire, but all those employees stayed in their home, you have a finite number of homes. Like how you can't even, I talk to business owners all over, they can't even replace the labor that retired because there is literally nowhere for their replacement labor to live. So this is the wheelhouse for us. We work on it in Otter Tail County. New London's doing it. Like places are putting up this type. The idea here is not that you need to build workforce housing. It's that you have the workforce housing. It's currently occupied by the wrong population. Center for Rural Policy and Development has done these studies too to follow up on all this, and we see. So here's Renville County in 2010, the percentage of homeowners that were 55 and older, right, tend not to have kids in that age range. Like we're 51% of homeowners in the county were 55 and older 10 years ago. But today that's jumped up. And why is that? It's because this group got older, this group got older, and this group just got bigger because these people aged into it and some of these people passed away, die out of this. But you're able to bring in enough young people as these people passed away. So it's a very slow churn, but ultimately we're kind of weeding out the middle right now. We're not seeing a lot of middle-aged people anymore, which again, constraining your school enrollments. Hard to grow up with school enrollments when there's nowhere for the new people to live because the existing older population are staying in the 4-bedroom, 3-bath houses that normally would have been workforce housing. Just to show you an extreme example of this, Treasure County, Montana, 85% of its homes are owned by people that are 55 and older. Just FYI. I mean, it could be on the other end of this demographic shift. So really, I do want to talk about, from an economic development perspective, like, why should you care about this, like, move over senior housing? Like, we need to get away from the terminology of senior, because senior housing a lot of times is all in the assisted living. And when I'm talking to people that are 55 and older, like, hey, would you be interested in moving, into senior living? Their number one answer is, well, I'm not going over to the places where people are going to die. Like, we need to talk about in this housing continuum over time. Once you're out of workforce housing, there's still a whole continuum of life before you get to a continuum of care. And that's, assisted living and all that down the road, which you may be in a regional center anyway. But this is the wheelhouse, which is our move over housing's been filled. So it's inhibiting the ability for people to move in. So meanwhile, again, nobody really has a good purview on all housing in town. Like our Section 8 tends to have a light shown on it because you have an HRA that's interested in those housing units. But I would argue that our seniors have a policy of best intentions. And that is, I'm going to live in my house forever. And in fact, you have a lot of decisions being made right now that are encouraging people to stay in their homes and provide all these livability expenses. Like my mom, we're putting on a ramp on the home. We're, building out the bathroom of this 2-story, 4-bedroom, 2-bath place. So she's in by herself. So meanwhile, the doorway is being expanded. And we just spent $14,000 on that. So these are the types of decisions that get made in a policy of best intentions when you say you're going to live in the house forever. Now, before you start cringing and being like, you're not kicking me out of my house, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the 20 to 30% that would like to move over, but currently have nowhere to go. And we don't really have a good purview on that. So I would advocate for you to go and we're doing this in South Dakota. Go and interview seniors who are looking to move. Go and interview seniors who say they're never going to move. Go and interview, and I shouldn't even say seniors, people over the age of 55. Go and interview people over the age of 55 that moved recently by choice. And then another group of people over the age of 55 that moved recently, not by choice. Because within the policy of best intentions now, I'm going to expand on this, there's a lot of reasons why people want to stay in their home. We know this. 90% of seniors say of older people want to stay in their homes, but only 43% found it easy to do so. And then AARP does these studies that shows like, why don't any of these older folks want to move, right? It makes sense. Stress over moving, fear of losing independence, anxiety. You've got emotional ties to the house, fear of the unknown, right? So to accommodate that, in fact, we have a huge age-in-place movement. Like, the age-in-place strategies that we've got, we're going to help bring people to their doctor's appointments or serve them meals or whatever it is. But a lot of times I'm arguing here that our age-in-place should not always mean age in that house. When I start to do studies at the community level, residents of the towns would well prefer to age in community than to age in their house when it comes down to it. We did this in Hancock. I lived in Hancock for a long time. I was on the EDA. We surveyed all of the people over the age of 55 in all the surrounding townships around the city and asked them what their motivations were. And you end up with we really wanted to delineate between what happens when people would like to stay in town, but then what are the choices they actually have? So I'll go back to this age-in-place movement. Think about the billions of dollars that we have right now that are here dedicated to help incentivize people to stay in these housing units. But then what happens in this long term? Policy of best intentions doesn't really turn out because we know just 21% of people die in their homes. So what happens then when the policy of best intentions turns into reality, which is now I got to get my mom out of her home? She cannot go up and down those steps. And so now in town, I'm stuck in Hancock, realizing that there are no options. There's a waiting list for the ones in town. And meanwhile, now the real estate agent is telling my mom, like, hey, Ben, and your mom, you need to sell your house, but you have knob and tube wiring in that place. And you got to get that replaced or nobody can get insurance on that. And you have peeling paint and you can't get a first-time home buyer program if you have any peeling paints. You got to do these things. All right, my mom is like, are you kidding me? I just spent 15 grand putting on the ramp and updating the bathroom a year and a half ago. I don't have that kind of money. That was not an equity builder. That was a livability expense. And I would actually argue the thousands of dollars we're spending on ramps could be a community asset that we move from home to home across our communities or across our regions, something like this. So my bigger point is like, consider the total investment we're currently making in our age in the house strategy, as opposed to an age in my community strategy. So meanwhile, again, I'll remind you of those reasons why older people don't want to move. Well, what happens when you have to move in emergency mode? Stress through the roof. Fear through the roof, anxiety through the roof. All of these things are only exacerbated when we don't plan at all. And I'm not telling everybody they have to, because even if I were like, hey, mom, it looks like you're not getting around very well. My mom's like, shut up, I'm getting around just fine. Like sometimes you can't even have that conversation in your family. But meanwhile, my mom goes to the doctor in the afternoon and she's like, oh, I can barely get up and down the steps. Like we need to actually have these conversations for our towns, in my view, because that house is not just a private asset, it's a community good. Because if that house now becomes dilapidated or torn down, what's the impact here? So we know Kelly Ash with the Center for Rural Policy and Development, he's done a follow-up on my studies here that shows that these homes are going to become dilapidated. And what happens then to a dilapidated home in your community? What's the public cost of private inaction is my question here, right? Private, because it's a private asset. Well, I'll tell you that when I lived in Hancock, my neighbor's house, Howard, he's passed away now, but our homes were built in the same exact year. But you would have not known it because I like updated the siding and the windows and like all the stuff. And he worked for the railroad. He was on a pension. He had very little money and he had tons of water damage. Like you wouldn't even know our homes were built in the same year. But what happens and why should I care? As he is my neighbor about that home becoming dilapidated, because if that home becomes torn down, there's nowhere for labor to live. There's nowhere for anybody to live. But more importantly, imagine now, here's my stupid example. But here's the example. Imagine your town has 4 houses in it. And every year, those 4 houses are assessed property taxes. And right, you're assessed on that land and you're assessed on the structure on top of it. Right? And so last year, when Howard's house was standing, it brought in on average $1,000 for every home in town. This is ridiculous numbers, right? But $1,000. But what happens if Howard's house needs to be torn down, right? Right? So now that house gets torn down. The county now reduces its levy by $800 because you're not assessed on that structure that doesn't exist anymore. You tore that down. So what are you assessed on? Just the land. So now what happens in the overall property tax market here? For a dilapidated home, you lost $800 in property tax revenue at the county level. But did the county commissioners reduce its levy because Howard's house got torn down? Who pays for the additional cost of the reduction in property taxes on dilapidated property? Everybody else in town are splitting these costs. Like, so there is a direct relationship between the public and the private inaction and a public cost here. So really all housing is a community concern for me. I know generally you're probably in a role already that tends to be more concerned about housing than the general day-to-day resident. But my gosh, this is just for me a huge issue. Ensuring that we have somewhere for people to live. So then we have done these economic studies and we do have staff. FYI, I just had a meeting 2 days ago with them. And if you're interested in doing like this economic impact of a household or economic impact of a house, we've got some new data coming out. We just did this in Rushford. And so this was in Rushford. I've got a link, which I'll share with Susie too after this is over. But that shows the economic impact of a household that's bringing in so much revenue every year. So again, what's the impact if a house becomes dilapidated and you've got nowhere for labor to live? You've got nowhere for leadership to live. You've got nowhere for wealth creation to live. So we're starting to do more and more studies of not just the construction of, homes and what is the impact of that, but what is the impact of just having that house there? And this is just the average, we call them direct, indirect, and induced effects. And that's things like I have my job, but then I buy groceries and that creates other jobs, right? So it's kind of these ripple effects. And that's what this model portrays, is these kinds of ripples that you have through there. But there's more than just economic impact of spending. There's things like what's the impact of having a family bring in a school, bring in a child with us, contribute to the school district? What's the impact of bringing Ben in and I sit on the county commissioner as a county commissioner now? Excuse me. So this is all super interesting to me. Might not be to you, but this is like, how do we make the economic argument that we're trying to serve the public good here by seeing our homes as something more than just a private asset? So then again, you would argue like, why should I care? These people aren't in the workforce anymore. Well, we need to make the economic case. Why should you care about keeping the older people of 55 and older in your community? Because right now, a majority of your income barely comes from a job. 53% of all the income in the county, I do everything at the county level because that's barely even the level we all work and live and shop and play at, but it is this county level. So within Renville County, 53% of all the income every day that people make comes in the form of a job. Other components of income include things like people that own property and rent it out, like you get income from that, or you have dividends, interest, things like that. But a bigger one I want to focus on here is the maroon portion, and that is something called a transfer receipt. And this is old age Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And right now, these three categories they're called transfer receipts because they're transfers from the federal government to you, an individual, right? So it can be old age Social Security, and that is a retiree. It could be Medicare and Medicaid, whether you're a senior or low income. But again, when we look at this, a full 1/3 of all the income, components of income coming into the county come in the form of a transfer receipt, not necessarily from a job, but imagine now how many jobs you already have that are dependent upon these transfer receipts. Clinics, hospitals, pharmacies. I mean, up and down Main Street, old age Social Security is in this. And this doesn't even include 401ks. This is not private retirement accounts. This is only old age Social Security and pensions. So when we look at this trend line of the maroon bar since 1969, it's gone way up. We have the pandemic in here, but the trend line is continuing on. We expect that up to 40% of your income in the next 10 years will be derived from a transfer receipt. So now, if you do not have anywhere for these older people to move over to, they're going to move out and they're going to take these transfer receipts with them is part of our argument. So are we ready to lose 1/3 of our, income on Main Street because we don't have anywhere for people to move over to? So for me, economic development is beyond just people working in town. It's seeing everybody as an economic benefit across the community. So we do talk about moving over. We do know that workforce housing has been very difficult to do, but the move over housing has been really pretty successful. So I do talk about, I'm usually a positive narrative person, and our small towns aren't dying. We're actually very vibrant. We're still here. But at the same time, when I talk about these stories of people moving over in best intentions, it's a disaster. And I imagine, do this thought exercise just even in town. Imagine you had to move a relative in your community in 2 weeks. You had to sell the home. You had to find a place for your mom to live in town to stay close to her friend. Is that even an option? So, what does that really look like when people actually have to move? So those are the types of stories I like to lift up and share as examples of to ensure there's some sense of continuity for your town. Really, and it's continuity because again, we have people moving out, people moving in. So really this local service economy is only going to become more prevalent as we move forward. So really for me, all housing is a key. We build supply and workforce housing by making the existing stock available. Because right now, 1/3 of your stock are occupied by kind of the wrong folks that would want to move. And again, I'm not trying to kick people out that don't want to move. I'm trying to say there is an audience of people looking to move, and when you ask them and poll them, you'll find them. We've done this in Hancock, a number of other communities, again, doing that survey of townships, people over the age of 55, people moving in off the farm. But you need to engage in long-term conversations. Because it is well, I don't want to buy. My house is paid off. Well, yes, you want to shift your equity. Again, there's all these points of conversation. It's not as easy to say everybody just needs to think about moving over. You need to engage residents. You need to engage the older population about what their motivations are, what their expectations are, what really happens when people have to move. So that's why I mentioned that South Dakota project. My 2 favorite questions of interviews we're doing right now is interviews with people who moved in the past 3 years by choice. And then another avenue of interviews with people who moved in the past 3 years, not by choice. And what happened? What did you have control over? What happened to your old house? What programs did you tap into? So one other piece I want to hit on this in terms of a home as a community asset is if you have people in your homes right now that may be eligible for home weatherization programs, but the people in them or whatever are too proud to take advantage of it, get it done. Because otherwise, the incoming people have to pay for that themselves because they tend not to be eligible for these programs. So if you are truly concerned about all the housing stock in your community, step forward as a leader to begin these conversations about continuity for these homes. So we do know that these future homes are looking different. They're multi-generational. Some are multi-generational. I say it's like when you live with your grandparents or your parents are living with you now, right? This is the new norm, I will say. We are returning to multi-generational housing. When I say that, I mean, it used to be that way. In the early 1900s, multi-gen housing was the way to go. And then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is when it was like a nuclear household. But now we are back to 23% of new household formations are multi-gen. And what does that really mean for our communities? So that's another piece I just want you to hit on too. So let's see what else I got. What do I do know? The latest data that came out for the Center for Rural Policy and Development shows that in the most rural counties in Minnesota that have the highest death rate, they have now the highest in-migration rate. And why is that? It is through death that we are reinvigorating our towns. So it's very much continuity and cyclical kind of action that we have in our communities. Our communities are not these one-off dying things that are going to be gone when these folks pass away. It is a measure of continuity. We are trying to build some semblance of continuity between the past, present, and future. You guys do that at the institutional level. You do it within school districts. But ideally, we need people to see this day to day, that their towns are places that people want to live and survive it. So really, I just talk about community housing succession. Like maybe one of the best things that you can do for the future of your community is ensure there's just somewhere for people to live and engage. High school students, I'll just say this, like, man, your high school kids, that telling them all about the trades, that you could be banking it in the trades, go to school for the trades in 2 years and get out. We are so short on trades folks right now, so short on construction folks. And when 3/4 of rural homeowners are baby boomers and older, those homes are going to need a ton of work, and we're already short on those folks. So I'll stop there. I just want to say thanks for your interest in the topic and wanting to do something for your town. I'm here to serve with extension. So if there's other things you could do, as I mentioned, Bridget Tuck does these economic impact studies on, we're starting to do these new housing studies around it, which is super interesting. Really just would like some feedback too. Like everything you've heard today is a result of communities just asking, like, what about this? So I'd like to know, like, what do you want to know more about? I would say. So number one, thanks for hearing me out. Number two, thanks for your service. And if you got anything for me, let me know. So thanks.
Do you have time, Ben, for a couple of questions?
Oh yeah.
Okay, all right, and I'll also note for the record that Steve Alpering has zoomed in, the developer that we've been working with. And so Steve, if you've got questions, feel free to raise your hand as well. Does anybody have some questions?
Sure.
Okay, Jen?
Question for you. Have you seen any HRAs implement any programs to encourage the additional housing unit concept in the community?
Sorry to
The
support which
mother-in-law
program?
suite, if you will.
Oh, okay, so number one, I'm not really a housing person. I'm just a data person that tells me like all of these things are happening all the time. I am trying to build a base and extension. Right now, we don't have a lot of expertise. I hear these stories all over the place, but honestly, my number one avenue in is through our regional development commissions and our initiative foundations to know like what might be going on in the region. But I do know every town is so different. I mean, every town is so different. It is like build the army of the willing from town to town about people wanting to do it. It's not even about consensus building this time. So I wish I had better examples for you. I'm working with Don Hegland out of the RDC right now to do case studies. We're doing, I think we have 12 case studies. So we've got some students in Morris that are going to be doing interviews with developers and with HRAs to look at these different projects that have been happening. But I really wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. I am just kind of, I wish I did, but I don't.
One, just in your like knowledge of other communities, how have you seen like the 55 and older senior housing impact the ability for other people to move in? Like obviously we don't want people to just die to get people to move in, but I feel like every small community that I've seen who has put in some version of a 55 plus has been able to open up more homes for other individuals. Like apartments don't seem like they always work as well because small families don't want to move into apartments. So like, what are you seeing in regards to like housing for 55 plus? Because I think a lot of people, when they think of senior housing, they think of assisted living.
Yes.
I think a lot of people don't need that. They just need a place to live, but I think patio homes are. Like even what we saw with Steve's case, like it was hard because they were so expensive and we have people who can't afford that, or maybe they don't want to own that later on in life.
Yes.
Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so again, this is like, do we have a role in the public to help support housing development in the private sphere here? Is there really I mean, we've had roles in the past in terms of tax credits and offering infrastructure and all sorts of things in the past. Maybe it's got to look different as we move forward. So I totally agree. The assisted living, I call it the continuum of life housing. It's like the single floor living, apartments, condos, patio homes, something like that. I hear consistently from housing studies that the housing studies don't actually capture much of this. They don't, all they talk about is the workforce housing. So I think part of this is trying to get our housing study folks to get away from the boilerplate around workforce housing as the only solution. Well, I mean, another avenue here is if your land is too expensive, maybe there's a solution here around land trusts. Maybe there you can, defer or delay the costs of that land up front. This leads into all this other research I do around transfer of wealth too, which is you want to, when you have land that's owned by people locally, you're generating wealth here. But if I own land in Olivia, like you can't benefit from that when I'm in St. Cloud, right? That's not your wealth anymore. So land trusts are a way to ensure you've got some local control. I mean, this is the onus of it is at what point do you feel as though you've got a public responsibility to intervene? And this is going to be the hardest conversation you have. As what is the public role in a private asset? Like when we look at that economic impact, every year that household is bringing in $135,000 in spending. Is a $15,000 investment in a home on the front end to ensure that house is here for the next 50 years? Maybe that's worth it. This is the question. Do you see that as an economic development investment? Economic development has changed so much. It's not just about, again, bringing in the industrial recruitment business. Like you've got the jobs right now. Right now, housing for me is the crux. And this is the hardest conversation to have. Because again, it's that public-private mix. You're going to answer to constituents about why should you invest public funds in a private asset. It's because that is a private asset, but it's also a public good. It's a public good that persists over time, well beyond individuals. And that house, I differentiate between house and home. A house is your structure, a home is when I'm living in it. And that house was a home to someone before, that house is a home now. I hope that house is a home to someone in the future. So maybe other things I want to talk about here is just home rehab. Like have a community toolbox, have Habitat for Rehab in your town. Because right now, what kind of shape are your homes in? I will say, number one, do a free inspection, say what do they call them? Pre-sale inspection for all the people over the age of 55, just so they have an idea of what would need to be done to that home if they had to move. And it gives you a pulse on what kind of condition are your homes in. Because right now you don't generally know until you're actually in them or they hit a point of transition. But even the points of transition you don't always know because it might go to the kids. Or, I mean, you can go ahead and gather your assessor data. Ask your assessor to give you a report on housing transitions, on parcel transitions. And so some of the things I do is I look at housing parcels that transition from like Ben Winchester to the estate of Ben Winchester. Right? Then, well, that's not available to anybody else to use anymore either. Or my mom is in the nursing home and she expects to be out of there in the next 6 months. So we're just going to hold on to the house. And again, that house is not available to anybody else at that point. So I don't know. I just like to raise the hard questions. It's not an easy job here. I love this work though, because I believe we should be making an investment in this public good. I'm trying to make that argument, right? You're in that role, whether you believe you should be making these private investments or not. I'm just trying to make the case that maybe there's a reason we could invest in that upfront now because we're going to get payoffs for decades down the road. I'll just stop talking. Other questions?
Does anybody else have some questions for Ben? I think he's given us a lot to think about and ponder.
And I'm happy to engage again too. Any way I can support you in decision making. I just know this is for me the wheelhouse of the hardest conversations to have right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you much. Steve, do you have any questions for Ben?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, I was at a doctor appointment and meetings here, so I wasn't able. I'm just walking out of the doctor's office now. My question really came down to the one that I think you answered is where is the value for public contribution to private business? And I think that's where we really need to kind of look at that whole situation. To me, is how does that work? How is it viewed by other private people to say, oh, well, this person got treated this way? How do you walk that line and say, well, it's not really this person get treated preferentially. It's a contribution back to the community, like you're demonstrating there. And how do we quantify that in a mathematical equation to your, okay, if each patio home gets $15,000 contributed, you know, to reduce the cost or whatever it might be, or an incentive to the buyer to say, okay, you have to pay full price, but you know, the community will give you 15,000 or something like that. I think that's really the conundrum where this project is at. And going back to it's the cost of a house in Mankato is the same as the cost in Olivia, but most of the residents in Olivia still want the cost relative to old housing in Olivia. And how do we get over that or try to bridge that gap?
Yeah. No, that's great. And I like the line that all housing development is affordable housing development. You know, because I think there's some acronyms too around affordable housing too that tend to pigeonhole the conversation about what that means for everybody in town. Yeah, I could certainly appreciate that, especially since you're on the wicked edge of this, Steve. Like, you know, how would we be spending on this? I'd like to know, if you enter in these conversations with people, like what are the sticking points that you have, or you personally? I mean, we might have people in this room that have different views of public investment. So I mean, just to engage in this in a healthy way is a good thing. I'm just happy you're having the conversation about this.
Yeah, and I really think that's where we've left off right now is, you know, the cost of a patio home to go on this particular lot we're talking about, you know, plus or minus, it's going to be $375-ish, you know, and that's with, you know, the cities and the EDA has already been gracious enough to quote unquote, you know, not charge hardly anything for the land. But where does it come into? Well, if the property taxes are going to generate $5,000 a year for the next 50 years, and the people that move in are the, you know, the family of four maybe that are going to generate the 100, where does that balance come out? And I think that's where the EDA, city council, and I'm just going to say myself for this point, or any developer, where do we fit that financial equation and the transparency thereof that, you know, somebody else, it actually goes back to helping the people that are moving in, not necessarily the developer. Because for myself, I'm truly trying to get this project done in an altruistic way without not risking my family's, you know, future in the process. So I think that's where the help that, say, I and the EDA are looking from you is, what is the right economic financial equation where this is a win for the city, win for the people that can move into this transition housing, and for me, to a certain degree, not risking everything.
Right. Yeah, I think these are the exact questions we're trying to get through in these focus groups or these interviews and case studies, kind of we want to do with the RDC out of Appleton. So Steve, I may actually have you on my list to call here in the future, if you don't mind.
No, I'd actually prefer if you would, yes.
Okay. Right.
Okay. All right, well, I think we'll let you go, Ben, and thank you again very much for your time and information. And like I said,
Anytime.
it's a lot to think about. So,
Right on. Well, let me know what I can do for you. I'll send a copy of the PowerPoint here so you can share that as well.
oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
You
you
bet.
very
Have a good
much.
one. Yep.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody.
Bye.
Okay. Well, I think since we're in the interest of time, we'll move on to number 5, the Olivia Storage LLC, and I assume you're Austin Nygaard?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'd be Austin Ivar, live in Olivia, my business is in Olivia too. This town would be the town that I grew up in, so this opportunity would be a good opportunity for the town and myself to invest in it. So my plan out there, I purchased some property about a couple months ago out south of Subway. Plan is to, right now I help manage my dad's storage units, and there's a long waiting list of people to get in there. So just trying. So purchased the property a couple months ago, and then plan on doing 36 units out there. Hopefully it'll all be done from January 1st. And then hopefully future down the road, I can build another storage unit if the demand is there. And then kind of the biggest takeaway for the city too is right now it's a 5-acre parcel. So I want to split out the land into 3 different parts. It's just their parking lot or some type of small commercial business, they can buy the land and build out there. So, and then through the project, all my vendors have been local. I mean, concrete has been local, banking local. The attorney I used was local, the electrician, so throughout this whole project, I've been keeping the dollars local to the community. Kind of the biggest part. And the building permit, applied for a building permit. First part of September, took 2 months to get approved. It was a real pain or hardship at my point. And then the building permit came back and it was over $8,000 to build this building. Comparative to, say, in 2017, my dad's storage unit that blew over. He paid a $600 building permit fee. So I mean, say we all know inflation occurred, but say that $8,000 bill, that was a pretty shocker to the system, just because it was self-storage. Say it's a low profit or a low margin business. I mean, we're not looking to say build it for X. I mean, you're working with $50 here, so that $8,000, it was a hardship for the project. So kind of the big benefits for the city is just with the need of self-storage. I mean, having Ben present up there. He said with the housing transition of the older clients, well, they need a place to store their stuff. And then other topic for the community too is with future development out there too. I'm taking a big parcel of land, breaking it up, so just in case if somebody wants to build out there, they can build out there. So.
Well, I can verify the need for storage.
Yeah. It's like everybody has stuff.
Yeah, especially if we want people to move out of their houses and, you know, into their downsizing. Yeah, it's a good problem.
Yeah, so.
Do you know why it was so much more the building permit?
Yeah, because the city, I mean, I have receipts going back to 2017. The city, how we used to do it is you would supply a building receipt. So let's just say my cost of construction was 200,000. You would have submitted that to the city if there was a dispute, and then it would go back. And now our building inspector, he goes by the national average for that type of structure.
Our building inspector uses the ICC calculator. He's using it from the 2022, so he's actually using a 2-year-old building calculator. And what he does for these types of projects is the plans that he receives has the information that says, oh, your plans are detailed with this classification. So he plugs in the classification that he's provided into this building valuation calculator to come up with the valuation for then his building permit fee.
So my building valuation was $830,000. Which
Based on
Are
the
you-
information
Yeah.
that came on the plans you submitted, yes.
yeah,
The cost of building for you was 800 and.
no, my cost is maybe 1/4% of that.
Okay, but the value of it and.
The
What- so
building
what is the
val-
800,000?
So the building valuation is from the plans that Austin provided to our building inspector. It had certain codes about, well, your structural code is, I think it was like IBB or something like that. And so Darren, our building inspector, takes the engineers that have classified the buildings as this way, plugs it into the ICC calculator to get then the valuation, and he does this across jurisdictions.
And then that's what the building permit is
The
based on
building permit
percentage
fee
of
then
that.
is based off of the valuation that is calculated through this ICC calculator.
What's the typical percentage that we're charging for building permits?
Tom asked that at the last meeting and he said 1% and I kind of thought, no, but I